It's an Archaeo-Death interview with Professor Howard Williams and his guest.
Welcome, Archaeo-Deathlings. It's Professor Howard Williams here, back again for a part 2 with my special guest, Andy Brockman, exploring conflict archaeology and heritage. Hi, Andy, again.
Hello again, Howard. Thank you for asking me back for another bite at the Archaeo-Death cherry.
And there's so many nested identities. Martin Brown discusses this in the book I edited with Mel Giles about archaeology and the dead. How, you know, the remains of the dead are their person. There's a family connection. There's a regimental connection. There's a national. But then also the archaeologist finds an affinity with the person as well, because anyone can. Even if you're not related to them or you become, by the very presence, you're recovering their remains. You're part of their story in a sense.
Absolutely. I mean, I can give you another example of that from the work we've done. I mean, I've done a lot of work really since the late since 2010 on maritime issues, and particularly the looting of shipwrecks.
Okay.
And the monetization of shipwrecks. And British military shipwrecks in particular, because a lot of people, we talked about the Commonwealth War Graves Commission earlier, who do a fantastic job looking after war graves on land, and they're actually protected under the Geneva Conventions and Hague Protocols and so on. And they have a legal status. A lot of people don't realise there's no such thing as a war grave at sea. In international law, if you have the permission of the flag state, or it's done by the flag state itself, you can rip apart a wreck and monetize the steel and the non-ferrous and from the propellers and the engine room plant and so on. And it doesn't matter if hundreds of people were lost with the ship. It matters morally increasingly, and that's where the work that I've been doing with colleagues came in, because it started off with 3 British cruisers that were sunk off the coast of Holland in September 1914, the so-called Livebait Squadron. In fact, it was a Dutch amateur historian, Henk van der Linden, who's actually a school teacher, and some recreational divers who notified the British Embassy that a Dutch salvage company was actually ripping off these wrecks, which were thought to be British government property. It turns out that they weren't British government property anymore, because they'd been sold to a salvage company in the 1950s. And their status was sort of thus very, very ambiguous. In fact, the British government has since, partly as a result of the campaign, and certainly as a result of the campaign that Henk ran, they have more protection. And in fact, the salvage company involved was prosecuted at one point for stealing some artifacts from wreck in British waters. That was the first one, the sort of Cressy, the Hogue, and the Aboukir. Pretty soon thereafter, I got involved in investigating what was going on in the case of HMS Victory 1744, which was a British 100-gun ship of the line. She was effectively the flagship of the Royal Navy at the time. She was state of the art. She was only about 3 years old.
Wow.
And she was lost in a storm in October 1744 in the English Channel, with all hands, including the Admiral in command. And in, I think it was 2008, a Florida-based salvage company called Odyssey Marine Exploration, people might have seen the TV series called Treasure Quest, which they facilitated and looked at their work. Basically, they went out looking for shipwrecks that they could monetize.
Wow.
And they claimed that HMS Victory was carrying $500 million worth of gold and jewels from the merchants of Lisbon back to London. And they based this on a Dutch newspaper called the Amsterdam Courant, which allegedly published this information in November, about a month after the sinking. but they were never able to publish, or at least they never have published, the extract from the newspaper so it can be verified and the translation checked. Wessex Archaeology did a report on it and asked for it and didn't get it. And anyway, to cut to the chase, they would raise money from investors on the prospect of this salvage, and they tried to pressure the British government into allowing the salvage, even though it's what's called a sovereign immune vessel. It's still part of the Royal Navy. You can't touch it unless the Ministry of Defence says you can. And again, cut to the chase. In 2012, they made a TV documentary partly about the wreck of the Victory. When the documentary came to be shown in 2013, it's called $1 Billion Wreck Hunt, and they showed human remains being recovered on the site of the Victory, or being uncovered on the site of the Victory, and use that as an excuse for not continuing with the excavation. And there's a very moving scene in the on the salvage ship where the two archaeologists who were with the expedition had this conversation about how it's important to do the right thing, and we told the government, and we're not going to do any more work on the site. Sorry, investors, your money can, it's sat in our bank account now anyway, allegedly. When we asked the government what information they've been given about it, certainly the Joint Casualty and Compassionate Centre, which looks after military casualties, including historic military casualties, our question was the first they'd heard of it. The status of those human remains, and even when they were actually uncovered, we're still trying to find out about.
So you have been acting as, both a field worker, researcher of conflict archaeology, and increasingly evolving into a campaigner, investigative journalist. I mean, when did that move happen, or was it always at the start? How did that happen? How did you? Because these are pretty shocking instances where your passion, investment, expertise is allowing you to lift the lid on pretty stark behaviors by governments, businesses, private individuals. Shocking. Absolutely.
I mean, take HMS Victory as a case in point, and the West family, who were involved, who were the descendants of the admiral who was lost on the ship, were passionately against the salvage. They felt that the ship was a grave, and the wreck site was a grave and a memorial, and should be left alone, and certainly shouldn't be commercially exploited.
No.
That didn't stop the Ministry of Defence and the then Defence Secretary coming up with a sweetheart deal to allow Odyssey, through a British charity set up by a leading member of the Conservative Party, access to the site. And in fact, they gifted the site to this for nothing, although there are arguably a couple of £1 million worth of bronze cannon down there. It's a complex and murky story, and again, I've written articles about it. There are articles elsewhere about it, and it's still working itself through. But I think the thing that really changed me into investigative researcher, rather than an archaeologist, although the archaeology is still very important, was 2016. We looked at the case of HMS Queen Mary in the North Sea. She was a battle cruiser that was sunk during the Battle of Jutland, with the loss of over 1,200 lives. So the largest single loss of life on a ship during the Battle of Jutland. Skagerrak, as the Germans call it. it's been known for a while that the Jutland wrecks have been hit by illegal salvage. But back in 2016, we knew from the work that Innes McCartney had done that the damage to Jutland wrecks, something like 2/3 of the Jutland wrecks have been damaged, and in many cases heavily damaged by illegal salvage.
Wow.
But colleagues of mine found a source in the salvage industry who had a set of photographs from a Dutch salvage company called Friendship Offshore, and they showed, and again I'll share the link to the article that was the result of it, but it was clear from one photograph in particular showing a piece of kit that could only have come from Queen Mary that they'd been working on Queen Mary, and there was no record that the British government had allowed any salvage work whatsoever on Queen Mary.
Yeah.
So that the piece of forensic archaeological documentary analysis has proven that these guys have been where they shouldn't be. And cut to the chase, colleagues of mine in the archaeological world had back-channel conversations with the government, with the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, with the Ministry of Defence, Historic England, passed on the information, expected something to be done about it, and nothing was. And in the late spring of 2016, Britain was about to go big on the 100th anniversary of the centenary of the Battle of Jutland, when Queen Mary was lost, and the sacrifice of the mariners of all nations who were lost on that day. And we thought that was just a little bit hypocritical, given what was going on in the North Sea under their noses.
Oh, yeah.
So we decided to go public on the story, and I wrote a major article that got picked up by other parts of the media. I worked with the BBC One Show on a package for the One Show, where the BBC researchers brilliantly tracked down the family of one of the guys who died on Queen Mary, and we were able to show, what had been done to the wreck, what had been done unlawfully to the wreck, and they were able to give it the human dimension that I think it was a great uncle or something like that kind of relationship, that this person was still remembered in the family, and they were deeply offended by what had happened, and the fact that the British government had done nothing about it, although they'd known about it.
Shocking.
And yeah, and I think, and that, and it comes to the latest one that we've been working on is the case of Prince of Wales and Repulse in the Sea off Malaysia, where we now know that for almost 50 years, those two wrecks, which are again maritime military graves, as the MOD likes to call them, and memorials to, I think it's about 840 Royal Navy sailors were lost on the two ships, including an Admiral Phillips. And Captain Leach of the Prince of Wales, who was the father of the Admiral who commanded the Falklands operation in 1982. But those ships have been looted increasingly for the last 50 years, and in fact since round about 2012, 2014, they've been looted industrially by crane dredgers. One in particular that is now currently, and its crew are currently under arrest and may face charges in Malaysia. But again, the government is being slow to react, and we now know from a parliamentary written answer that they have recovered human remains in a scrapyard in Malaysia, which may well be the remains of some of the crew of Prince of Wales in particular.
They're doing very just systematic dredging of everything and finding the bodies amongst the wreckage.
Well, I mean, again, trigger warning, because this is quite brutal, but basically when a warship like that sinks, it's a big metal box, and anything trapped inside it remains trapped inside it. And in many cases, some human remains, some bodies are swept away and are probably lost forever. If people were trapped inside compartments, particularly sealed compartments and action stations with the watertight doors shut and so on, they're still there. and sometimes the state's preservation is very good. And it's but what the crane dredgers do, they either use explosives to blow the ships apart, or they use giant drop hammers to sort of break off bits of steel, or they just put down a grab and just grab what's there. But push comes to shove, basically the ship that we've been looking at most, and at least my colleague Giles Richardson at Mast has been analysing the work of. It's a Chinese registered crane dredger called the Chuanhong 68. That ship is capable of carrying something like 3,000 tons of steel at a go. And what they were doing was basically systematically stripping the wrecks and then taking it to a scrapyard in Malaysia for processing. And that included anything that was inside. We also believe that other artifacts have been recovered from the scrapyard.
So you've been investigating all these shipwrecks, and which many people do believe. I mean, I'm not up on all the legal stuff, but I would have colloquially referred to them as war graves, even if I hadn't, academically sorted it through in my brain. I discussed them as such because that's what they are. But legally, they have no such protection.
No, I mean, one of the joys of doing this kind of work, and there aren't many joys, it's pretty grim stuff sometimes, and certainly you see sometimes you see people at their most venal in terms of what they're prepared to do to make a few bucks.
Yeah.
But some of the people I've had the chance to work with along the way, so for example, Professor Mike Williams from Plymouth University, who's one of our leading maritime lawyers, has given advice on the legal situation regarding these things. He happens to be a diver and is involved with people, something called the Joint Nautical Archaeology Policy Committee, which is a cross-sector expert group taking in everybody from has Historic England have an observer status on it, the various diver groups and so on, as well as academic archaeologists and maritime archaeologists. It's a real coming together of expertise, and they've not been afraid to confront government and heritage bodies and say, look, the policy here is really lacking. There was a for example, there was a stage a few years ago when Historic England was very loath to schedule sites, and particularly sites to do with maritime. There's a famous case of the group of tanks that were lost in a D-Day rehearsal called Exercise Smash in Studland Bay in Dorset. They're now a protected site. They weren't previously. But that's a lot of the work there has been done by Bournemouth University and the maritime archaeology course there. So, and again, that's a memorial to D-Day, and it's a memorial actually to people who died rehearsing for D-Day, because a number of the crew members of those tanks, they were swamped. They were if people remember the D-Day, the famous duplex drive, the swimming tanks that had screens that enabled them to float and make their way ashore. These were prototype based on a British tank called a Valentine, and when they sank as part of Exercise Smash, a number of the crew were killed. And so, again, we're into memorialization.
Wow. And of course, that famously, the Exercise Tiger Memorial duplex drive tank is at Slapton Sands at Torcross.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes.
Absolutely. No, it was and again, if we're talking about historical narratives and where archaeology can support them and so on, this is the narrative of the build up to D-Day, of which Exercise Tiger was another part. Exercise Smash was a British operation. Exercise Tiger was American.
Okay, Andy, this has been even more interesting, and we're moving on to new and further projects that you've been delving into. Let's get back to this for part 3, but for now, thank you so much. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Howard Williams on YouTube. In addition, consider following the ArchaeoDeath WordPress blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.